This is our last keynote of the conference, AMICAL 2021, the closing keynote, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our closing keynote speaker, Leslie Chan. Leslie is Associate Professor at the Center for Critical Development Studies and Director of the Knowledge Equity Lab at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. Leslie's teaching and professional interests center on the geopolitics of knowledge production and circulation. His work focuses on how networking technologies are enabling new forms of collaborations, while at the same time amplifying and reproducing embedded power relations and inequality. He has been director of BioLine International, an international collaborative open access platform since 2000. Leslie was the principal investigator for the Open and Collaborative Science and Development Network, OCSDNet, as well as for the Knowledge Gap Project. GAP is Geopolitics of Academic Production. He serves on the advisory board of the Directory of Open Access Journals, the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, and he's a steering committee member of the International Working Group Invest in Open Infrastructure. He has published widely on access to knowledge, open science, knowledge inequalities, and scholarly communications. When Mahabeli suggested inviting Leslie as someone who could speak on equity and knowledge production for us at the conference, AMICAL's paradoxical situation immediately came to mind for me. AMICAL's member institutions, by their nature, tend to have strong North American curricular, pedagogical, and professional influences. And that puts them in this position of propagating on at least some levels North American cultural hegemony. These same institutions at the same time often have intentionally intercultural institutional identities. And that gives them this unique leverage to use the critical interdisciplinarity of liberal arts to make efforts to invert that cultural hegemony and help ensure that underrepresented perspectives are given voice through discourse and through scholarship. And so one of my hopes is that hearing from folks like Leslie will provoke or inspire us towards thinking of ways that we may be able to help exercise that leverage that we do have, and through the knowledge production that our institutions enable and contribute to, find ways together to improve and not diminish equity in the production of knowledge around the world. So I give the floor to Leslie Chan at this point to talk about open praxis as social vaccine for knowledge equity. Leslie.
Thank you, Jeff, for that kind introduction, and thank you to you, to Alex, and to Maha for inviting me to give this closing conversation with you. I'm both excited and also apprehensive because you know, we've been in lockdown for quite a while, and I think most of us has gone through highs and lows with online interactions. So someday, you know, I feel energized. Some days I'm not so much because of this constant screen time. But this morning I'm energized and so glad to see many new colleagues and also learn from where you're coming from, and also learn of some interesting connections that are there already. So what I want to do today, as Jeff mentioned, because this is a closing discussion, I will try to be a little bit more provocative and hopefully inspirational at the same time. So what I have to say, you will find some of the claims I make may be a little bit more ambitious than can be done in reality, but that's really the point. I'm hoping that we can I can provoke some reflections and dialogues, and then we'll have some common thinking about where we can go from here in terms of creating the kind of system and infrastructure that enable a kind of knowledge equities that I'm going to describe. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you at this point. Just give me a second. So you can see the full screen of my slide right now?
No, Leslie, we're only seeing the your browser window.
Okay,
I
I'll
I think
redo the sharing.
I think
The
maybe if
desktop.
I think maybe if you stop, yes, if you stop sharing the presentation,
You can
Mhm.
see the presentation now, though.
yes.
Yeah, so I'm using the desktop mode, so you should see my presentation now, right?
Okay, good.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So, so I have chosen the topic called Open Praxis as Social Vaccine for Knowledge Equity. And again, you know, a lot of big words and probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense at this point. And I hope to try to make some sense out of this. And I think the notion of vaccine is really as a reminder of the time right now. I want to acknowledge the particular situation we're in now in a global pandemic, and there's a lot of uncertainties, obviously, and there are a lot of uh, you know, speculation as to where we're heading and what universities and education and everything else going to be like in the near future and the longer term. And I like to propose that I think we need to take this moment to think more critically about a lot of the embedded assumptions in our education and knowledge production system. And we are already familiar with many of the existing inequality in the system. And of course, the pandemic brought out so many pre-existing inequalities in the system that people are very much impact very differently depending on their socioeconomic location in society, and of course also in their geographic location. So even though the COVID virus is supposedly non-discriminatory, our society is highly discriminatory, and the consequence of the disease is that it impacts society very differently and individuals very differently. And again, this is not new to us. Everybody had personal experience of one way or the other about this kind of differential impact and how existing inequalities in many forms are manifested and exaggerated in the current condition. So I like to suggest that we need to think about a way to address these embedded inequality in a more fundamental way, so that when we move forward, we do not see these kind of recurring problems that, again, continue to hit certain segments of society, particularly those who are already marginalized. So the idea of the social vaccines is really about a set of social policies that encourage the thinking of collaborative, collective infrastructure building that built on human social relationships with the help of technology, but really subsuming technology as a kind of support that allow us to build the kind of system that we see as being more just and equitable to everyone who wants to take part in
Excuse me, Leslie, let me
yeah.
interrupt you. Are you moving the slides forward?
No, I'm not. Sorry.
Okay, all right. We weren't
This is
sure.
my long-winded introduction.
No, it's lovely. We're just
yeah.
wondering if the screen sharing was working. Okay. All
Yeah.
right. It's fine.
So,
Perfect.
so oh, speaking of moving the slide, so what we decided earlier is that there's going to be three segments in my discussion. So feel free to raise any question in the chat, and then I will take a pause after the first segment, and then to see if there are questions that I need to address before I move on. And then if not, I will move on to the next segment and so forth. And then at the end, hopefully we'll have more time for joint discussion as well. I hope that's okay with you. So this three segment I have in mind, I will first want to situate some of my own personal biases and where I'm coming from in terms of why I'm saying some of the things that I'm going to be saying. And then I want to share some personal experience about my involvement with different activities and thinking about openness. We're all familiar with open access, open educational resources, open educational practices, open pedagogy, you name it. There's so many open this and open that, and there are a lot of commonality, but there are also a lot of differences. So there are a lot of cross domain lessons that can be learned. But I'm going to talk mostly about things that I've learned, mistakes that I have made over the years, and there are many mistakes. So I have to take 2 days to tell you all the mistakes I've made, but hopefully some of those mistakes will be instructive as a way to build on different way to think. And then finally, I'll close with this notion of social vaccines built on the notion of open praxis, that is thinking of openness as a set of reflective practices and actions, rather than thinking of openness as a set of conditions that need to be met. I think right now, a lot of the debates about openness, open access in particular, is so fixated on what constitutes open access, under what condition is it, and under what condition it isn't. And I would like to shift our thinking away from thinking about the conditionality of open to the action and praxis, the actions related to open as a set of social action that collectively can allow us to build a social network of what I call social vaccine. And I would invite you also in a minute to help me think about what you can bring to this toolkit of social vaccine. Just again, to qualify the use of the term praxis, I borrow from Paulo Freire. Many of you are familiar with the Brazilian educators who have been reminding us about how we need to rethink education for emancipatory purpose and for social justice purpose, and challenging existing dominant structure in our education system. And this required more than just talking, but it required collective actions and critical reflection. And I'm very pleased to see that I was looking through the agenda for this meeting. Unfortunately, because of the time difference, I was not able to attend the talks themselves, but I read almost all the abstract. And I'm glad to see there was a very good mix of practice and reflections. There's a lot of obsession on learning, doing new things, but there are also lots of sessions on critical reflections of what it is that we're doing and how we can do them in a more equitable way. So hopefully my closing comment would fit into some of those earlier reflections. So I want to really drive home certain premises, and that right now our system of education and knowledge production, particularly at a global level, is deeply problematic. And I use the term ill health again, just to draw a reference to our current time. Our system is sick, is very sick, and has been sick for a long time, but we haven't really addressed them in a really structural and systemic way. We tend to address the service level in a more functional way, patchwork, band-aid approach to fixing inequity. And I think, again, the moment in time remind us that we cannot continue like that. So, again, as I said, personally, I've learned that openness itself, when used uncritically, actually lead to further problem. Because if you put open onto an existing system that is highly unequal, what we see is that those who are already in power and already have the resources and know-how to take advantage of open resources and data and so forth, they become far more powerful, and those who are disadvantaged become far more disadvantaged. So openness by itself doesn't address inequity, in fact, exacerbate inequity. And this is a lesson that learned by many people across different sectors that work with open, not just in open access. And so again, in the end, hopefully I can convince you something about the need for this social vaccine thinking. I also like to see, well, as you're listening to me, I've set up this Mentimeter site. I hope you can see that. And you just go to the site, put in the code. Many of you have used this before. So if I'm talking, if something come to mind and you want to share what you like to put in this toolkits of educational technology that constitute part of what I'm going to say about social vaccines, please share it. I will come back to this at the end of this, but if something come up in the meantime in your mind, feel free to share it through this. Thank you. So where I'm coming from, I asked many of you, I'm currently in Toronto, Canada, and the university for which I work for, the University of Toronto, sits on the indigenous land that used to be occupied for many centuries by the Huron-Wendat, and then most recently by the Mississauga of the Credit River. I'd like to, if those of you not familiar with the diversity of indigenous cultures, language, and nations, and I'm only learning this in recent years, many of these languages have been erased, unfortunately, through colonial settlement with specific policies of the government to actually systematically erase indigenous culture, language, identity, rituals, and belonging. And so in recent years, thankfully, there's growing recognitions that these kind of unjust, horrendous act of government on indigenous people need to be known and need to be acknowledged, need to be redressed. And so land acknowledgement has become part of our institutional fabric, but it is not simply just acknowledging the past, but it is really about actively working towards a more equitable future and how we can think about knowledge in its diversities as part of our institutional mission. And so I'm again still learning, but this is part of my own daily education, if you will. So I mentioned that I work at the University of Toronto, and herein lies the contradiction. So on the one hand, we are reminded we have to acknowledge our past and some of the injustice through the kind of colonial system and privileging of a certain way and ideology of knowing. On the other hand, I get regular reminder from my university how special our university is, but of course using this particular yardstick called university rankings, which most of you know are really nonsense, but yet become a kind of a idol worship kind of exercise for many university who wants to become world-class. Again, there are so many problems. Many of you are familiar with these type of ranking, and yet the university loves to parade these rankings whenever it favors them. So this was from last year, and then a few weeks ago, we got another announcement about how our university is ranked in Canada and so forth. Again, these are rather meaningless. And those of you who know ranking knows that the older the university, the more resources the university, the higher they rank. That's so this ranking is really about a reflecting of historical privileges of these institutions, not really about excellence, however you want to define it. Now, I want to mention these because as Jeff mentioned in the introduction, the work that I've been doing is really about understanding knowledge production from a geopolitical perspective. Why are some form of knowledge privilege over others, and why do we continue to have these kind of highly inequitable distribution of knowledge system around the world? So for years, I've been trying to understand, and of course, this map shows the world highly distorted, but it's distorted through the lens of the journal impact factors and citation metrics. So if you want to see the world through these distorted lens, you see the world in a distorted way, so that the US and Europe, this cluster of countries here are disproportionately represented relative to the many global South countries. The whole continent of Africa is this long, what my colleague call a pencil. And this is not to say that, and of course not that knowledge are not being produced in other part of the world. It is just that through these kind of lenses, knowledge from other parts of the world are just not seen. They're essentially rendered invisible by these very narrow metrics. And these metrics, again, ironically, are the ones that also feed into university rankings. And so we have a system that perpetuate continuously the kind of inequities that's being structured into the system through history, through colonial settlement, and through all kinds of unjust social policy. So for the past 20 some odd years, I've been asking this big question for myself and my research groups that can open access, open science, and all these open this and that, can they really change the power structure of the current global scientific production system? And that more importantly, can different form of open practices create more equitable form of collaboration between institutions, particularly between institutions of very different power dynamics and power and resources, the global North and the global South. And we've seen lots of inequities in so-called collaboration. Can open practices change these? And this is still an ongoing question. And of course, there are many different take on it. Now, in recent months, there's been lots of enthusiastic publications about how open science in particular, the rapid publications of scientific results and the open sharing of data has been instrumental in the quick understanding of how COVIDs are constituted and how they spread, and then how to design the vaccine for them. And so it's been in record time that many vaccines have been developed, and many attribute that to open science, the open sharing, and all these kind of things. And yet, of course, the vaccines that were developed, as we know, are very highly unevenly distributed, so that over 75% of the vaccines has been distributed so far only fall into the 10 richest countries in the world. And I have to admit, I'm one of those lucky people who lives in Canada who have both my vaccine shots, and yet most of the people in the world today we have to wait a long time before they even get a chance to that. And in the meantime, we still have these countries who are opposed to the proposal to bypass the patent restrictions using the TRIPS, the intellectual property waiver agreement that has been actually in place for many years. This just TRIPS waiver was designed 20 years ago to deal with precisely the problem we see today, access to medicines in times of emergency to bypass the patent system. But of course, we see many countries opposing, and right now these patents are still the private property of a small number of multinational pharmaceutical company. So what's open data and all these other things are open to these organizations, but what is ours is there, what is theirs is theirs. This seems to be the case. And there's the other argument, a lot of these drug companies that even if we give the patent out for free, most countries don't have the capacity or the infrastructures to manufacture the vaccine anyway. Countries like South Africa, India, and Brazil has the capacity, but most countries, even if you were to give the patent formula, don't have the capacity to produce them. And this is true. And I think this becomes the other deeper question, is that why are infrastructure also so unevenly distributed? And why can't we think more fundamentally about infrastructure building so that each region, each countries, or each partnerships could use their own infrastructures to build the kind of system that they need for well-beings and all kinds of things. And so I'm fundamentally, I'm really making an argument about the need for building local infrastructures, which has been eroding over the years. Now, speaking of local infrastructure, I just want to quickly diverge to a project I've been working on for over 25 years, online platform for open access journals. So it's one of the first projects I was involved with in terms of open access. And we were supporting a number of peer-reviewed journals from various global South countries. And as this is now going in, well, it's been going on since 1993, and we have been lucky to work with quite a number of journals, many of them from across the African continents, to understand how their research, local research, would otherwise wouldn't be reached by international readers through this open access platform, actually that is based in Brazil, supported by our colleagues in a biodiversity center. We built this very basic infrastructure back in 1993 and still supporting a lot of journals from the global South for global distribution. I want to draw attention to this particular journal and a podcast that we produced with Professor James Tuini, who's the editor-in-chief of this journal, which is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. Professor Tuini was frustrated with a number of things. First, that a lot of the local research that they do is so important for understanding health in their own local regions. Cannot be published in international journals because the editors are not interested in publishing these so-called local disease issue because they don't think their international audience are interested in it. And so out of frustration, Professor Tuini started this journal to help record local research, but also mentor young researchers so that their work on local health issues could be shared. One story that Professor Tuini shared with me was that before he started the journal, he was actually working in some public health initiative, and he had a paper he wanted to publish. At the time he was in Zimbabwe, and so he sent the paper to a British-based journals, and he got a rejection from the journal. A few months later, he was working for Oxfam, and he had to move to Oxford, and he lived in a street called Edinburgh Drive, and he submitted the same paper back to the same journal, same paper. And that paper this time was accepted because it was coming from Oxford address rather than an address in Zimbabwe. From that, he realized that really a lot of this system inequities are so deeply embedded that he wanted to begin to do something through publishing his own journals and mentoring young researchers. So, like many of you who work in the early days of the internet, I was one of those very early optimists, right? And when the so-called the World Wide Web came about, I was one of those early people, and I was still in graduate school then, to say, wow, you know, this will change everything. We can publish everything on the web, and we can share everything. We can, you know, just basically level the playing field, and it is going to change everything, right? And so 25 years ago, and of course, there were a lot of naive assumptions about what all this means. And let's say one of the things that we fail to understand is that, of course, the complication of the infrastructure itself, that the current internet infrastructures and the way the network is built is not a flat system, is already highly hierarchical. And so that hierarchical system of domain and command and control reinforces a lot of the concentration that we see today. So the notion that somehow the network is democratic and open to everybody was an assumption that we didn't really reflect on at the time. And Sarah Lambert and many others have talked about this kind of naive view of open, what she called openness determinism, which is really a variation of technological determinism. This naive view that somehow opens everything is good, and that it will democratize knowledge and education, and it implicitly really privilege the role of technology in doing that. Somehow technology will be the driver of change, and that if we only adopt these technology, we know how to use these technology, we close the digital divide and so forth, and everybody will be rising, in this rising tide of internet optimism. Of course, that hasn't panned out at all. And we're seeing the kind of digital inequalities being manifested today, particularly when we are have migrated to all the remote learning and teaching, and of course, doing research. Those who are well-connected, well-resources are reaping more benefit and are protected from the disease itself. And those who are digitally marginalized, they are actually more exposed to the risk of the virus and anything else that was brought forth by the virus. So there are lots of limits, but also obviously potentials of open. And I've been lucky enough to involve with a research project that involved 12 different teams, including a team from a university, the American University in Beirut, colleagues to study how citizens could become their own knowledge maker in their own regions to advocate for the kind of environmental and social changes that they want to see. And all these different projects from around the world reminded us that the kind of simplistic openness determinism cannot be imposed on different regions of the world with very, very complex regional historical challenges and political challenges. And not the least is a lot of indigenous community reminded us that actually the openness discourse is not new. In fact, is one of the central discourse of colonialism, that all the land that the European seas are really open for the taking. They just have to claim it, name it, and that becomes theirs. And indigenous people are expelled from their own land and excluded from the benefit of the land itself. And so a lot of indigenous community have been reminding us that, openness is not something that they would embrace without their own governing principles being embedded in how knowledge ought to be shared. That openness, again, can be abused and have been abused at the detriment of many marginalized communities. And so we need to think about different perspective of open, particularly from the perspective of the people that are most affected by the knowledge production system itself. And this is the kind of lessons we have put together. So I'm sharing some of these resources. Hopefully they'll be useful. And some of these resources, I'm happy to say, are feeding into a UNESCO process on this global document on principles of open science. And many of you are familiar with that process, and the final draft of that UNESCO document should be out in November of this year, with many interesting recommendations, particularly for censoring multiple form of knowledge as a way to understand openness. So
Leslie, sorry.
Yeah.
You asked for about a half-hour reminder, so
Oh yeah, okay,
we're about
great.
there.
Perfect. So are there any questions that are in the chat that I should address at this point?
There were no questions, but there's been a lively discussion about the role of Canada and other countries in in how they've dealt with vaccines, and also sort of tangential discussion, but very interesting one about colonizer and colonized languages and how far you have to go to find either.
Right. Okay, great. So hopefully we can come back for more wholesome group discussion about that as well. So I guess at this point, I could, fast forward to today. We're still learning about what constitute open and why openness itself is not enough, because what we are seeing increasingly is that the kind of infrastructures that are so important for so many things, for our online learning and our our knowledge productions, from research to publications to monitoring and all those kind of things are based on technology infrastructure that are increasingly owned by a small handful of multinational corporations. And so that, many of you are familiar, of course, with publishers like Elsevier. And Elsevier is not just a publisher. Elsevier has, in fact, been very active in building a comprehensive end-to-end platforms that can capture researchers' work from before they even do their research, how much funding they will get, where they work, and what kind of interest they have, to the publications they do end up having, to the data that they share, to the metrics that they accrue, and so forth. And they have built these very massive infrastructures of data capture so that they can then create a kind of analytics that they would then sell back to the university to help university make decisions about how they can rise up on the global rankings. And so what we have is a very tight, close, conflicting system that are owned by these small handful of multinational that are driving increasingly how we do our daily work in terms of how we share our work. So even if there might be open on the surface, the infrastructures by which we do these works are not open at all. And in fact, the governance of how these infrastructure work are completely opaque to us. But these systems are built on, as I said earlier, a system of hierarchy and control that allow these kind of control to be embedded and built in and concentrate in the hands of the few. Again, I don't have the time to go through the mechanics of all this, but we've been documenting some of these development. If you're interested, you can look at some publications we have about this particular platform and closed system of knowledge and knowledge enclosure through infrastructure. And so we might be thinking about, how much, article processing charges and what kind of permission and all that. But underneath it, there are way, way deeper issues of enclosures and boundaries that are being built into our system. This complicated looking maps really show you the knowledge production system from beginning to end for researchers, and how a company like Elsevier are able to capture everything from the beginning to the so-called predictive analysis of who will do well and what university could benefit from. So in other words, policies are often now being underwritten by these platforms, so that some university have in their strategic plan how much they want to do in terms of rising up in the ranking. And of course, I hope to have demonstrated these kind of things are now controlled by private interests, and their interest is really in maximum extractions for profit. And so their missions are very, very contradictory to our public missions of the universities in general. And so we have to really think about what it is that we're relying on in terms of our infrastructure. I also want to recommend this amazing little publication by Keller Easterling, looking at infrastructures of all sorts. And her book document different kinds of global supply chain. And I think knowledge production and education actually fall very neatly now into these global supply chain, because we, again, have a handful of suppliers and company that are now structuring how we share, how we do things through coded technologies, so that we might think we have a choice of where we publish, what we publish, but in fact, by the time we go under the system, we already been streamlined and encoded in ways that we want to interact. Again, these are the things that are being studied, and I would encourage us to think about that from your daily experience. So now I finally go to my final sections. I hopefully can finish that on time. And again, linking to the current inequity in vaccine. But before I do that, I want to again remind us that this notion of vaccine is built on a particular disease model of health. That is, seeing a vaccine is about targeting a particular pathogen or virus or whatever, and you target that and you get rid of it through a particular medicine, a particular technology. So it's a very techno-specific way of addressing disease and health. And that there's also the assumption that if you get rid of the cause, the agent of the disease, you get rid of the problem and you will have health as a result. But of course, the World Health Organization has reminded us a long time ago, health is not just the absence of disease. Health is the total well-being of our physical, mental, and social well-being, right? So just getting rid of the virus doesn't restore health, as we can see today. And so there has to be broader thinking about what health means and how the infrastructures and social policies support health and support understanding of diseases across the spectrum. And in recent years, of course, public health scholars have reminded us over and over again that there are many distant causes or proximal causes of health that are not directly germ or biological specific, but they are determined by the social system in which we live, the kind of employment, income, education, and political policies and public health policies, of course, that are in existence. And of course, in many countries, unfortunately, a lot of these public health infrastructure has been decimated in favor of these just-in-time way of thinking. And vaccine is very much a just-in-time model in terms of a kind of building capacity for everybody kind of thinking, right? So vaccine thinking is an example of how the benefits of science are highly, highly unevenly distributed, as I have been arguing. And again, just to remind ourselves how the uneven distribution of vaccines that the World Health Organization is calling scandalous. And of course, a lot of these underlying problem is about the technology itself. Like vaccine as a technology reminded me, interestingly, of the work of Professor Ursula Franklin, who was a professor at University of Toronto for many, many years, a pioneer scholar, a really feminist scholar of technology before such a term exists. And I would highly recommend this book and based on the set of lectures he gave. And she reminded us that when our work, whether is work for in the public sectors or the private sector, are being turned into discrete chunks of tasks, those chunks of tasks could be easily managed and manipulated by those who are in charge. And these technologies, she calls them prescriptive technologies. And in political terms, she referred prescriptive technologies as designs for compliance. And I like to think that a lot of our technology, these enclosed technologies, are precisely designed for compliance. Compliance in terms of a set of standards that are dictated by a small group of powerful corporations, not just in knowledge production, but in education itself. So our infrastructures of teaching, the Canvas, the Blackboard, the Turnitin, you name it, all these technology are privately owned without regard to understanding of pedagogy. And so I want to now really more specifically refer to the connection to this notion of social vaccine. Again, the notion of social vaccines is actually not new. And a group of public health researcher, Fran Baum and her colleagues, been talking about this for some time. And she says, so they say that social vaccine is really a process of social and political mobilization, which leads to increased government and other institutional willingness to intervene with interventions applied to populations rather than individuals. It is aimed at mitigating the structural social economic conditions that make people in communities vulnerable to disease, illness, and trauma. And so that while medical vaccines help immunity against disease, social vaccines develop the ability of community to resist and change social and economic structures and process that have a negative impact on health and force the government to intervene and regulate in the interest of community health. So the key point here is really about mobilizing our political will and ensuring that the government pay attention to the kind of public policies that address the populations as a whole, not just those who would benefit as individuals, and that tends to be, again, the privileged ones. And so these are really public policy as social infrastructure, but as also social vaccine. In the articles that I refer to, Professor Baum and her colleagues gave these examples, giving back indigenous land rights and subsistence and their autonomy to self-govern, redistribution and restrictions and regulation of corporate advertising. And I would put under this the restrictions in terms of corporate ownership and concentration of the kind of infrastructures that we use. There are lots of conflicts of interest we can point to, and now there's a lot more talk about regulation of big tech. And I think we need to think about how we need to apply regulations to big tech in educational technology. They also suggest taxation for progressive taxation, fair taxation really, for using those resources to supply for the broader community. These are some of my thinking about social vaccines, and so that we really need to think about community design and govern infrastructure, build on the principle of multiple forms of knowledge. It's not only one specific Western type of knowledge that is seen as universal. We need to expand the rights of research and participation, so that there are many knowledge holders and makers in our community. Students are themselves knowledge holders and knowledge makers. And in our teaching, we need to understand how best to facilitate students as researchers who have rights to learn, but also rights to do research that benefit their own well-being. We need to think about open praxis, again, not as conditions, but a set of framework that would encourage policymakers to support and allow community to design community-governed tools and infrastructure that ensure equitable knowledge sharing. And underlying all this is really a call to reinvigorate our thinking about education as something that is about based on a care economy rather than a market economy. I think we hear too much about the takeover of how we can better market our educational system for more student customers and so forth. And that has really continued to drive the kind of enclosures and hierarchy that we continue to see. So I'm gonna stop here. And as I said earlier, I hope some of you could help me think about what you would think of as part of things we can include in this toolkits of social vaccine through this website or through the chat or through our conversation now. So I will stop here and have some Q&As if you have questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for this wonderful keynote. There are no questions right now in the chat, but I think people were listening rapt to your keynote. Hold on, I'm seeing folks post things in the chat. So let me read this. So we are so Anji from the American University of Central Asia is writing. We hear a lot of American-style liberal arts institutions, most accredited by US based or EU. We might all be here in the position to be pushed to publish in Scopus journals. How do we redefine our roles in our respective societies? Where do we start the conversation with our funding bodies, assumingly US based, if we fight for anti-status quo approaches in terms of publishing? Seeing as these institutions are all accredited by US accreditation bodies.
Yeah, and herein lies the kind of deep strongholds of this power structure, right? And so because many of these institutions are accredited by US-based criteria, and these companies, Scopus, Web of Science, and Journal Impact Factors are so deeply entrenched that they become kind of the de facto standard. Now, if you look to other parts of the world, Latin America in particular, you'll notice that Latin American countries have historically been very different in terms of their education research system. That there's been a lot of resistance to this kind of Western US push, and they have been the leader in open access journal publications and monographs. So there are thousands of open access journals from Latin America. And in recent years, they have been creating their own evaluation system that are specific to Latin American regions. That is, how do they value research that serve their communities, not necessarily the quote international audience. And so there are lots of interesting work that are being done in Latin America. I can put together a list and share it with you, Alex, or Jeff, and we can share it with the rest of the group. I can put it into my slides later.
That would be helpful. Yeah. We'll send a follow-up material to registrants for the session, so we can include that there. Kara Jones, the library director at the American University of Sharjah, is thanking you first of all, and is asking if you've come across the iNorms Research Evaluation Working Group. What makes a fair and responsible university ranking, rating the rankings criteria? They have started a good conversation on correcting rankings. If you have any thoughts on that?
Well, so my question is, what makes a fair and responsible university ranking is why ranking at all, right? So why do we want to rank university? What's the purpose of ranking university? And many people would say, oh, well, these ranking allow people to make decisions. You know, students, in fact, often international students, make decisions about what school they want to attend according to rankings. And so these rankings serve to me an instrumentalist purpose that is not necessarily inherent to the mission of the university itself. So there are many different ways to think about evaluation or appropriate, contextually appropriate excellence. So again, if you look at many Latin American countries, they refuse to join these ranking games, and they want their university to be valued according to what they contribute to their communities, right? Many universities have in their missions about being a good citizens within their communities and contributing back to the society. And why don't we evaluate that commitment? You know, how are your university doing in terms of uplifting your community around you? How's your university doing in terms of ensuring sustainable futures in terms of environment? How's your university doing in terms of honoring indigenous knowledge and many different forms of knowledge? Our students' bodies literally come from all parts of the world, but our curriculum still only narrowly reflect the European canons and traditions. So we're not doing very well in that regard. If I have to rank my own university on those criteria, our university would rank very poorly. And why shouldn't they be held accountable to those missions, right? So if you really want to rank, I think we need to think about what it is that we value, what criteria do we value, but why rank at all? Rankings are insidious. Ranking, it just create the winners and the losers, the top and the bottom, and then never ever helpful for anybody. We don't need to have ranking in the first place.
Thank you for that response.
And some of you might have caught in the opening introduction, I'm on the board of an organization called DORA, the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment. And you can, someone maybe can share the link to DORA. And there on DORA, there are lots of resources on different thinking about research evaluation and different thinking about appropriate, locally appropriate excellence. And so there are lots of people thinking about outside of those boxes. So I would really strongly encourage you to for your region and to say, well, how do we break out of these? There are examples, and there are communities, right? So again, we can put together these resources of how you can find both in Latin America and also the rest of the world in rethinking assessment.
So I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat right now. Maha was earlier asking if there were any interesting results posted via the Menti.
Oh, let me see. There are a few. Should I share it?
Whatever's comfortable. Would it be more? I'm not sure if I can do it for you.
Sorry?
I don't think I'm able to do that for you. I'm not able to see that.
Yeah. Can you see that now? There's not many entry at this point.
Let me.
You can't see it?
Yeah, we're able to see it. I just
sorry.
We were able to see it, and then you unshared. This was before you shared your version, right?
Can you see it now, or?
Yes, we can. Oop, not anymore, but we could. Yeah, now we can as well.
Yeah, so it's free educational technology. It's interesting. Again, there's a lot of emphasis on technology itself of being free, and again, cost itself could be deceptive, right? And I think issues there is really about governance, and who make the tools. So if we have free educational technology given to us by Google and Amazon, what does that mean compared to tools that we as educators built for our needs and for our communities? And so, again, I hope I make the point about the social vaccines is about building those capacity, is building the human resources and building the human relationships that are necessary to support the kind of complicated work for education. Well, if you have other thoughts that you want to share with me later, I would love to hear them. This is an ongoing thinking of mine, and some of you might think it's still half-baked, which probably is not far from that, but hopefully I can shape it to make more sense of it.
I think your presentation is both insightful and I think challenging to a group like ours, which is where there's some degree of silence. So I think some of us may be processing and thinking about the ideas that you mentioned. At least that was my own reaction. I can't speak for everyone here, obviously. If we don't have anything else, and I'm not seeing anything else in the chat, I want to thank you again. Maha agrees with me, and if she does, yeah, I was also thinking enough that I've been disrupted in being able to sort of help facilitate here at the end. So thank you so much. This was an incredibly profound, I think, keynote, and it was a wonderful way to close and sort of think about moving forward how AMICAL itself can participate in some of these conversations and move forward in a way that's more supportive of some of these values. There are a lot of thank yous in the chat. Before we head out, Leslie, you're welcome to stay or depart at this point. I'm going to leave it up to you, but I would like to hand the mic back to Jeff Gima to close us out for the whole conference. Thank you again, Leslie. And
thanks so much for that. Thanks, Alex. That was a wonderful presentation, and I really liked, I just want to mention one thing from your presentation. I like this idea of that placing the label of open onto existing systems with their inequitable power structures just perpetuates the problem. And so I think just as a small thing in terms of AMICAL's conversations about open going forward, it can help us to be thinking about the way we're using that language and the nuance and what we're really trying to do with open and what our goals and objectives are. But anyway, that was it really helps to sort of think more analytically about the conversation about openness going forward. Thank you so much.